Madam President, pursuant to Rule 26, I designate Senate File 2503, number 158 on general orders be made a special order for immediate consideration. I yield to Senator Skoye.
Number 158 on special orders. Number 158 on general orders. Number 1 on special orders. Senate File 2503. Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President and members. I'm in front of you today with Senate File. Let me find my glasses here. Senate File 2503, and this is the bill that is pertaining to the work that was done last year with regard to filtering grass strips. And this was a provision that was worked on that was to implement a water quality improvement program, a mechanism of grass strips along public waters that are commonly known as buffers. And one would not think that such a noble idea that had potential such positive outcomes for the state could have been as controversial as it turned out. But there was uncertainty with regard to where these filtering grass strips were going to be located, how much land was going to be utilized in the development of these filtering strips. There was uncertainty with regard to administration, relationships of the local units, soil water conservation districts and Bowser. There was clearly questions about how this was going to work within Bowser and how the APO authority that Bowser currently has was going to be implemented. The bill that we have in front of us today hopefully is going to take some of the heat out of this issue, and the bill addresses these questions that have caused controversy this past summer. Addressed is what is going to be mapped and required to have buffering grass strips next to the county inventoried public waters that the DNR Commissioner has approved. It is recognized that the administration of these water quality initiatives would be best done locally. The local counties, through their ordinance, or the local watershed district through their rule mechanism, have ways to implement these buffers on the ground. And many of these buffer strips will be accomplished through some sort of conservation program, RIM or CREP. But a significant number of acres will not qualify for these conservation programs, and the mechanism to implement these is best done through a local plan, locally administered. While Bowser could fine non-compliers under their APO authority, the locals can use their ditch authority to actually put filter strips on the ground and then use the current ditch authority to pay the landowner for the loss of that land use, and the ditch system will pick up those costs. This is much preferred and will result in better protection of the waters in Minnesota, and what I am encouraging members to support that would be the positive end result. So what do we have in the bill? We have clarity that the APO authority with regard to buffers is limited to $500. If land is to have buffers on it as part of a ditch system, the value of the land compensated is to be the value prior to the buffer installation. It clarifies the definition of public waters to be the waters on the county public water inventories approved by the DNR Commissioner. It clarifies the definition of with jurisdiction, either county through ordinance, watershed district through rule, or Bowser if locals do not take jurisdiction. Uses existing law for definition of vegetative cover and methods to measure ditch widths, recognizes that counties can use rule or ordinance for enforcement as well as the aforementioned $500 APO authority. Clarifies that money to be withheld from locals for non-compliance is to be the Bowser-generated funds, not all state funds. Clarifies that no reimbursement to compensate landowners beyond the cost of the project to the Drainage Authority. And so what we have is a provision that will use the current public water inventory that counties have adopted, that the DNR Commissioner has looked at, as the waters that are going to be used for determining what's buffered and what's not. And so I hope that this bill is able to move forward. I have a couple of thanks that I need to make. I need to thank Senator Marty for his effort. Senator Marty and I sat down prior to going to the Environment Committee, and we didn't make offers back and forth, but we worked to find out some of the rub spots. And I think that we did a good job on resolving those and bringing support from the stakeholders toward this bill. When we were in front of the Environment Committee, we had support from Farmers Union and Farm Bureau, from the agencies, Bowser and DNR, and from the members of the committee also. I want to thank Governor Dayton for his leadership. I mean, without Governor Dayton's leadership, this would not be moving forward today. Representative Torkelson and the House for their efforts in helping us find the right language for bringing this bill forward. And I ask for your support, and I'll stand for questions.
Is there any discussion? Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Madam President, and would Senator Skoye stand for a question?
Senator Skoye, you will yield. Senator Skoye will yield. Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Senator Skoye, for doing the work on this. Thank you, Senator Marty, for running it through the committee there. I wasn't a whole lot involved in this, but I do have a couple of questions, and I know the counties are involved or could be involved if they don't get involved. I think our body needs to understand that if the county boards come together and they decide not to be the enforcing agency, that Bowser then will become the enforcing agency. So Senator Skoye, I know there's a penalty of $500, so if the county were to assess the $500 penalty and it was paid, and let's just use a hypothetical that the egg producer might say, well, okay, I've paid my $500 fine now. I'm just not going to bother with this anymore. What's the recourse after that? How do they go about doing it? Is there some kind of an assessment that goes on, or a couple questions? If counties decide not to do it, I think the bodies need to know here, the senators need to know that the state of Minnesota is going to take it over, and how does that mechanism work, the sanctions?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Ingebrigtsen, the provision that you're referring to is part of last year's bill. And there is a current process for Bowser's APO authority. And in last year's bill, they limited the APO authority from the $10,000 that Bowser has authority for on other areas to $500 here.
Can't hear.
And with regard to the process, how
Just a minute,
Bowser
Senator Skoye. Some members are complaining they can't hear. So if we could keep the conversations down, please. Thank you, Senator Skoye.
With regard to Bowser's APO authority, that's current law. That was longstanding. My effort was to try to find a way to implement this bill outside of that, because I think everybody recognizes that if that's the mechanism that's going to be used, where Bowser is the administrating agency, their ability is limited to this $500 APO authority. It's not going to work very well. So in our work, what we've tried to do is clarify for the local units what their responsibilities would be, what with jurisdiction means for them, how the relationship between the soil water conservation districts and the board operates. The soil water conservation districts in Minnesota have had a long-standing water plan mechanism in place where citizens groups get together, make recommendations to the soil water conservation districts through the county water plan, and then the county boards approve those plans. That's the process that we would like to work through as we implement this buffer program. Will that occur? Well, some of that's going to be up to the counties. And there was a provision initially in the bill as drafted that is currently in the tax committee. It's a county program aid component, recognizing that the counties are going to have some administrative costs as they operate as the ditch authority, that we would like to partner and help them pay those costs. I think that's a provision that's also going to be important because it's going to be assistance as the counties are the local authorities. Your question is if that all goes bad and they don't take the jurisdiction, then Bowser has their $500 APO authority. That's current law. We didn't make changes to that, and I am hopeful that that is not the way the direction that this goes.
Senator Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Senator Skoye, for that answer. And members, I think it's important to remember, well, when you talk to your county boards, that you encourage them to take over the management of this. So they have an opportunity now to have local control and take local control, and with this bill, it does just that. And I think that's, we're much better off dealing with somebody that we see face to face at the city coffee shops every day versus a bureaucrat, state employee that comes out and enforces the law. So thank you again, and members, encourage your county boards to do that. And thank you, Senator Skoye.
Senator Gazelka.
Thank you, Madam President. Will Senator Skoye yield?
He will yield. Senator Gazelka.
Senator Skoye, first of all, thank you for your work on this. You and Representative Torkelson, I think, have done a good job pointing it in the right direction. My area that I represent is a combination of agriculture and lakeshore, very similar to your own. And I just have a question related to the lake owner part of it. There typically is a 50-foot buffer or more, and I want to have clarification that that's really not part of this bill. I think that's handled somewhere else, but if you could clarify that just to give me some comfort there, I'd appreciate it.
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Senator Gazelka. My understanding is that lake shores are regulated under their shoreland ordinances, but the other thing I would like to say with regard to these parcels is anything that is running into them off of the land would have to have been part of the county public waters inventory in order for them to be regulated. And so while I don't have the exact understanding of the relationship between this bill and the current shoreland ordinances, the shoreland ordinances are in place regulating the 1,000 feet around lake shores.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Would Senator Skoye yield?
He will yield. Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Skoye, thank you for bringing the bill forward, and thank you for the work that you brought and have done regarding this. But I happened to be at a quarterly business meeting for the townships just a week and a half ago, and at the quarterly business meeting, they were talking about the buffer strips and the concern for who is going to be the one at the bottom of the chain here enforcing it. And although it says counties in here, the townships seem to come to think, because they are the ones that are the closest to the farmers and the ones that are going to have to be watched over as far as these regulations put into effect. Is there anything in the bill that talks about townships or their involvement in putting these regulations in place?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. And Senator Anderson, no, and the townships are not involved in the regulation of shoreland. That's a county or a watershed district role. The townships are not involved in this at all, and they're not mentioned in the bill.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. So, Senator Skoye, then, when the townships and the commissioners were at this meeting for Wright County, they were basically asking me if I knew where they would be a part of this, and you're mentioning watershed districts and the people that are involved there. It seems like, though, when it comes to actually stepping forward and making sure that this gets enforced in whatever township it may be, that the township board is the one that gets confronted with this type situation. How do we respond to them in regards to what this is coming forward with?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Anderson, well, they don't have the authority over this, but what I would encourage them to do is to be part of their county water planning. It's a committee that the county puts together to do their water plans. When I was in a previous part of my life, I was on the Clearwater County water planning. It's a very good process, brings together township officers. My recollection is that there was a county commissioner that represented there. We had the staff of the soil water conservation districts for technical support, and the greater community. At that time, I was farmer in Clearwater County. I was part of the Water Quality Planning Board. It was a good process. That's where the start of this is, when they identify areas that look like they might have some concerns, whether they're bank sloughing or areas that need riprap or other things with regard to water quality. That's where the start is. And clearly the townships of the county, through their association, would be able to have membership and input at that level.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Skoye, I'll just give you an example, a situation with one of my townships where a permit had been allowed back in the 90s, and somehow the permit did not get to the DNR, and the situation was that they had put in a culvert under a road to allow a small pond of water to be drained from one area into a major lake. And in the process, the DNR said that they needed to do a reapplication or after-the-fact type reapplication for this particular culvert, even though it had all been approved. Since that time, back in the 90s, several of the owners that live around this pond and around this lake now have changed their minds as to whether they want to have this pond lowered because of circumstances that individuals within the different housing developments are concerned about. And so the township is going to ask the county Soil and Water Service for help. They basically say, well, it was permitted through the Department of Natural Resources, and Bowser gets involved with this whole thing, but they're not getting any answers back. And so as much as you say that Bowser and some of these agencies are supposed to have oversight in this, it seems like the brunt of it comes back down to the township being involved, and I appreciate the opportunity to say, or appreciate your saying that these township officers need to be involved, but they have been involved, and yet they're seems like the the paperwork and all the tracking of the way this thing takes place falls through cracks. And I'm just concerned that if townships don't get involved with some of this more and more, that we'll have another fiasco going forward, and I hope that doesn't happen. So again, thank you, Senator Skoye, but just wanted to reiterate the fact that and you reiterated yourself, that the townships need to be involved in this situation with waters.
Senator Dames.
Thank you, Madam President. And would Senator Skoye yield?
He will yield. Senator Dames.
Thank you, Madam President and members. Senator Skoye, when we heard this bill in the Jobs and Ag Committee, there was still some questions about how the appeal process was going to work. And when it left the Ag Committee, you had stated that you would be working on this. And so I was just curious if you could give us just a short summary of how the appeal process will work if somebody, a farmer, wants to make an appeal on maybe the determination of the ditch, if it should be a 16.5 or a 50 or something like that, how that appeal process would work and who would have that authority and who would do the appeals.
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Senator Dames. Well, it would be dependent upon the agency that has jurisdiction. If it's a county, through their ordinance, they would then use their public waters inventory mechanism for appeals to that. That's an established process that has been around, I believe, since the late 80s when the inventories were first adopted. The watershed districts would be through a rule, and you would appeal through the watershed district rule process, and again, tying back to the local water plan if they are going to be adding waters. Bowser would have an established appeal process in their current rules that they operate under. And so those appeals processes are established and have been in law. We didn't make any changes to them. It's what we've had in place.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, wondering if Senator Skoye would yield for a question.
He will yield. Senator Westrom.
Madam President, Senator Skoye, I've got a couple of questions if we could talk about the buffer law in general first. I've had several farmers and watershed board members, Senator Skoye asked me recently, we allow alfalfa on the buffer strips, but what do we have that allows them to plow it up at 4 years, 5 years when alfalfa starts not being a very good strong stand, for them to re-hay it? Is that permissible under the current buffer laws, and could you help clarify that for the record, or do we need to make a change to make sure that's clear and an allowable practice, as alfalfa would be a perennial like many other grasses?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Westrom, the language in the current law, and we did clarify that we are using current ditch law with regard to the vegetative cover, says that you have to have perennial vegetation. And so I'm not exactly sure about the plowing up, but I would think as long as they have perennial vegetation, it would meet the criteria. I do want to say one thing with regard to the haying of these buffer strips. While there might be the odd occasion where that would be done, a long, skinny 16.5 or 50-foot field doesn't very conducive to the large hay equipment that many farmers are using. But I think it is an option that they can utilize if they choose. And as long as they have perennial vegetation, they would be in compliance.
Well,
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, Senator Skoye, I'm wondering if you'd be open to looking at this with our staff, and maybe we could just make sure that is clarified as this bill, I assume it's going to move through the House, but Senator Skoye, I don't want to leave our farmers with that unanswered question. I thought it was a good question because the common sense would say you have to plow it up and retill and plant, and alfalfa, as you know, if you're haying it, loses its stand after about 4 or 5 years. I grew up on a dairy farm. I have experience with that. And my farmers that ask me that question, I'm concerned for them because, like you just said, the requirement of perennial vegetation, it defies logic to say that there's not an allowance to have a period to replant or to change the perennial vegetation there. So if you're open to that, Senator Skoye, if you would yield, is that something we could just absolutely make sure is clear so we don't tell those that might be interested in haying that you can, but in 5 years we find out that they can't replant?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Westrom, I turned around and talked to Senate staff, and they reaffirmed that it is a requirement of perennial vegetation. We will get the language and get it to you.
So,
Senator Westrom.
So, Madam President, Senator Skoye, on that topic, if you'd yield.
He will yield. Senator Westrom.
So, Madam President, Senator Skoye, is it your understanding as well then, just because it says perennial vegetation, there would be an allowance for replanting or re-tilling that area to re-establish a perennial vegetation? Is that your understanding too?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Westrom, that would be my understanding. I would assume there would be a reasonable timeline for refreshing the plants that are there. For any of us that have tried to grow grasses, there is maintenance required because you do have weed issues and other things, and at some point in time, the most economical and the best maintenance is to start over. And so clearly that would be part of the agronomics of establishing a grassy filter strip.
Thank you.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, Senator Skoye, thank you for that clarification. I think that's helpful to make sure we have a record set here as well as the understanding we would all have. I think it's a very legitimate question that my farmers asked me, and we want to make sure that we aren't hamstringing them. Senator Skoye, one more area I'd like to just talk about is the timeline that we set forth last year when this was put into place has very aggressive dates coming up. And Senator Skoye, I understand in an earlier version you had an extension a provision to allow this to be implemented over the next 5 years or so. If you would yield, Senator Skoye, can you tell us the status of that and where that is at?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Westrom, if you would allow me to add a little further to the previous conversation about the plowing up of the buffer strip for regeneration of the grasses. What's the language in the bill would require the first corrective action would be to notify the landowner of that there was an issue with regard to the buffer strip and what was their corrective action going to be, and they would say, well, we're planning on planting it, and that would resolve the issue. So I think that should take care of that. With regard to the timelines, through conversations with local units of government, as you indicated, I did have some date changes that had allowed them to have a little longer time to go through some of these processes. That was not acceptable in some of the quarters that we were working with. So what I've been telling all the local units with regard to the timelines is we're going to put this in place. We are going to make every effort that we can to meet these timelines, and we're going to make progress on getting these grass filtering strips in place. And we'll continue to revisit progress as they're moving forward, and hopefully we're able to meet the timelines. But my expectation is that we will be making pretty significant progress within those timelines.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, Senator Skoye, thank you for that answer. Members, I raise this issue because there is 87 counties across this state. Nearly 80 of them are heavily involved in agriculture. Certainly, as you get further north, you get more into the timber. But many of our counties have the ag land and are working on this buffer strip. But when this was implemented last year, we implemented this with just a couple years down the road of a stronger enforcement, basically, is what the law is doing. And we have watersheds, we have soil water conservation districts, we have farmers, private landowners, trying to still figure out what's affected. We're here today in 2016, just 1 year away from the deadline of 2017 in November, still clarifying what is intended by last year's legislation. And so, members, I think when my farmers, my watershed board members, and others involved ask us for an extension of more time so they can figure this out and do the best job possible, make sure they are aware of what resources might be available, where they could put CRP, and what other programs might be available, RIM and CREP and some other things have been talked about. Haying, if they want to change where they've been grazing or haying in their field. There are a lot of things that different landowners across the state are wrestling with and figuring into their crop rotations. And so, members, I would ask you to consider an extension. Senator Skoye had originally had some language, and I think that's very reasonable as we are pushing down the road very rapidly on this enforcement of buffer strips, clarifying it here today, making another change that, of course, everybody out there has been asking us to do, and but they're wrestling to get this done. And before I offer the amendment, one of the reasons farmers and board watershed directors that were in my office in the last 2 weeks were raising as a concern. CRP is one of the choices, and in many places probably a common choice of what farmers are looking at to put a buffer strip along a public waterway or a public ditch. But once the law goes into effect, there is an issue with CRP, according to them and what they're telling me, that there's an issue or a concern that after that date, they cannot put it in CRP anymore. And in some cases, it doesn't fit into their crop rotation right now, or for other reasons, they don't have it ready, or they don't know. We're already into this year's planting season, so by all rights, you've got next fall, potentially, if you've got a good fall, and it's not a wet fall, and they have time after their harvest, maybe they could get it in next fall or next spring. And after that, the law goes into effect on public waterways, and there's no more option then of putting it in CRP, because CRP won't let them enroll it, according to them and what they've told me and their concern. Once it becomes a law that that land is not farmable, then the CRP program won't work for them. So if we extend it, the landowners, the farmers, the local jurisdictions would have more time to sort this out and work it out. We don't even have all the maps out. They're not coming out until this summer by the DNR. And so, members, I think it's very reasonable to extend this. I would offer the A9 amendment and extend this for 5 years so we can make this workable for everybody.
Secretary will report the A9 amendment.
Senator Westrom moves to amend Senate File Number 2503 as follows, page 4, line 28, and this is the A9 amendment.
Senator Westrom.
Madam President, members, I would just urge you to work and let's respond to the request of so many landowners, so many local entities that are doing their level best to deal with this fast, aggressive timeline of enforcement that is now upon them. And so, members, as we try to fix this and make it work for the long term of the water health and the waterways that we are trying to protect, that we give farmers and landowners ample time to figure in what works best for them as they are contemplating whether they hay it, whether they graze it, whether they put it into a permanent vegetative buffer strip, or what works in their rotation. Members, I would urge your vote. Madam President, I'd ask for a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Westrom, well, there's a fair amount there, and so I will start working through some of the concerns that you brought up and are trying to address with regard to this. First of all, in the bill on page 4, line 30 through 32, I believe, yes, it hasn't changed. Nothing in this section limits the eligibility of a landowner or operator of landowner to participate in federal or state conservation programs, including enrolling or re-enrolling in federal conservation programs. I really think we did what we need to do to address the issue of the enrolling in the conservation programs. We also have been working with the DNR, and one of the things that I've actually been quite pleased, they have now, by the end of this week, I think, have 60 counties mapped. And some of the counties that are not mapped is because the data is on paper and it's taking a little longer to get it into the digital format. But when we've got 60 counties mapped, we can start to see what the impacts are going to be for jurisdictions and where these areas are going to be. So I would encourage people to take a look at that. And so it's not going to be, middle of the summer for the maps, it's now. And that's a good thing because we're still in the legislative session. So I would encourage you to take a look at that. And then with regard to the extension of the timelines, remember in my opening I talked about this being a water quality improvement measure. And I think delaying it is not the direction we want to go. And so I would ask you to oppose this amendment. It isn't an issue with regard to putting the grass filtering strip down. That can occur this summer. The issue is how it's going to be compensated. And so we've tried to address this by the language in there that says that the value of the land shall be the value of the land prior to the implementation of the buffer strip. So when they're going into the conservation program or into the ditch authority, they will be compensated on it as if it was fields. And I recognize that some of that is going to take some time. And so while extending this out to 5 years might sound like a good thing, I just am going to oppose it because I don't think it's really going to solve the answer. I think it's better to move forward, get the grass strips on the ground, and go through the process that we've laid out in this Senate file. If this amendment were to go on, I would not be able to support the bill any longer.
Is there any more discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the Secretary will take the roll on the A9 amendment. Everybody who's here has voted then? Everyone who's here? Okay. Okay. The Secretary will close the roll. There being 25 ayes and 35 nays, the motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. Are there any other amendments? Is there any more? Why don't we do third reading then? Okay. The Secretary will give Senate file. It's fine. Senator Newman.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a question. I do not have an amendment. If you would prefer that I wait for my question, that's fine.
Continue, Senator Newman. That's fine.
Thank you, Madam President. Will Senator Skoye yield?
Senator Skoye will yield. Senator Newman.
Senator Skoye, I notice on page 2, line 32, there is a provision in there regarding valuations involving alternative practices. And alternative practices to me are, for instance, when the height of the ditch bank would be of such a height that it would prevent water from flowing from the fields into the ditch. And so my question is within the meaning of or the language of this bill, are there still some alternative practices other than continuous vegetation all along the ditches that are in question?
Senator Skoye.
Well, thank you, Madam President, Senator Newman. Thank you. Really, that's a great question because in part of the conversations that we've been having with regard to these filter strips, everybody tends to recognize that this is not the only solution that we need for water quality in the state, and there are other practices that are more effective or better or used in conjunction. And what we're trying to get at with regard to the alternative practices is that retention ponds, other water quality initiatives, as long as they meet the criteria that we're setting forward, would be allowed. And so we are trying to be flexible with regard to this so that there can be other mechanisms used for water quality improvements.
Senator Newman.
Madam President, thank you. Will Senator Skoye yield?
He will yield. Senator Newman.
So thank you, Senator Skoye, for that explanation. I just want to just try and pin it down a little tighter. So under the terms of the current bill, there would be alternative practices allowed other than the continuous vegetation planting that we've been discussing now for, maybe a half an hour. And those alternative practices would include retention ponds or the height of the ditch bank or other things that would help with the water quality other than just the planting of the vegetation. Is that correct, Senator Skoye?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Newman, I think you're asking about a more specific list of alternative practices. Well, Senator Newman, you're hitting upon a legislative conundrum, because once you start developing a list, you start to exclude things if it's not on the list. And so we did go down the conversation of retention ponds and other things, but we really felt that we would try to be clear that we wanted to encourage alternative practices. They would have to be within NRCS guidelines or other conservation guidelines. And, they're going to have approval of the authority. So I think there's the safeguard in there that they will be effective. But we don't want to be limiting to just the list that we could create in this legislation.
Senator Newman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Will Senator Skoye yield?
He will yield. Senator Newman.
Thank you for that explanation, Senator Skoye, and I do understand that if we put, specific alternative practices, that may limit what we can do in the future. But that begs the next question: is there within the bill specific criteria that would have to be considered in granting alternative practices to the continuous vegetation?
Senator Skoye.
Thank you, Madam President. Senator Newman, on page 4, line 14, that provide water quality protection comparable to the buffer protection for the water body that the property abuts.
Senator Marty.
Madam President and Senator Newman, we did actually include the word retention ponds and other alternative practices, but as Senator Skoye mentioned, trying not to do too much, you do a list and you're excluding other things, but retention ponds was added on page 4. And I just want to say briefly that I think that I want to thank Senator Skoye and Representative Torkelson and the governor and Bowser, and people did come together to clarify a lot of things to make sure the process will work smoothly. And soil and water conservation districts, I think working with the farmers are going to find good ways, and there are alternatives in here. And I think in terms of the timeline, as Senator Skoye mentioned, the DNR, you can check out their website. They already have, I think it's 50 or 60 counties posted. I think once people see maps, there's a lot less unease, a lot less discomfort, but I think this is a case where all parties involved came together, and I think it's going to be a good package, and I think people are going to be happy with it, and I think it'll move us forward.
Seeing no further amendments, the Secretary will give Senate File 2503 its third reading.
Senate File Number 2503, a bill for an act relating to natural resources, clarifying and modifying certain buffer requirements on public waters and drainage ditches.
Further discussion. Senator Eakin.
Thank you, Madam President, members, and I do speak in favor of the bill. While I have some concerns about the timeline that Senator Westrom had raised, I do think that they're very aggressive, and I know that there's going to be more time needed in some counties. Obviously, some counties are much further ahead than others. Some counties have a lot more ditches and a lot more agriculture that have to be dealt with here. So, and I think you need more time to ensure that it's being done right. And so, for instance, with the alternative practices, sometimes there's more effective, more efficient ways of doing it to protecting the water, and I think that we need to make sure that we're taking the time to do it right. But this is a very good bill which clarifies a lot of unanswered questions. And so I think that we need to give a lot of credit to Senator Skoye and the hard work that he's put in on this, as well as the governor and Senator Marty as well, Representative Torkelson, and bringing everybody on board with this. And I think that it's clear that the farmers were being listened to here. The Farmers Union and Farm Bureau have been involved in this and testified in favor of the bill.
Senator Eakin.
So again, I think this is an example of what happens when government works and we come together and we find a compromise. So I urge your support and thank you.
Is there any further discussion? Secretary will take, I'm sorry, Senator Han.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate, Senator Skoye, you bringing this bill forward. I intend to vote for it. I was glad to learn in the course of your presentation that our new committee chair in charge of agriculture, environmental issues, Senator Marty, is also in approval of this bill. Glad to know that we all are on board. It does strike me, though, as a little bit ironic. I know, Senator Skoye, you credited the governor's leadership on this bill, but it was the governor's leadership that brought us the bill that we adopted last year that created this problem in the first place. And this seems to be a pattern, I've noticed, among our friends on the majority side, the majority party, that we do something one year over the objection of the minority, and that turns out to be kind of a disaster, and then we come back the next year and we fix it. We saw that with the tax bill. Remember that? The tax bill, the big honking tax bill that we passed that's still driving people out of the state. And we had the tax on repair and maintenance of equipment, and we had the tax on warehousing, and we got so much pushback from that that the next year we came back and we passed a bill to undo those taxes, which was then called by you folks on the other side a tax cut. That's how that worked. So we had to do that bad thing, and then we came back and realized it was really bad. Now we fixed it. Then we fixed it. Now we're doing that with this buffer bill that, again, many on our side last year objected to this bill, how it was written last year, that it was going to cause a lot of problems, that it was unclear, that it wasn't workable. All that was ignored, and the majority passed this bill. Majority passed the bill under the governor's leadership. And now we find out, of course, that it doesn't work. It's not a good bill, and I'm glad to see that we're fixing it. But this is the party of do something bad, create a problem, then come back the next year and fix it. And my question to the majority is, when are we going to have the bill that fixes the biggest mistake you have made, which is MNsure? We passed that bill, and if you're not part of the 0.87% of the population that's being helped by that, if you're the other 99.2% that's being hurt by that, when do we have the bill that's going to fix that massive problem? When do we have that? So, members, I'm glad to support this bill. I'm glad that we're fixing a problem that we created last year, but I think we should probably go forward and not make those kind of mistakes in the future.
Senator Bach.
Well, Madam President, Senator Han, I don't think the sharp rhetoric's all that helpful. And frankly, it's purely inaccurate. The language that went into law last year was negotiated by the House, members of your party, Senator Han, and the governor. And it had nothing to do with the majority in this Senate. And, Han, I just think if we're going to go down that road of that sharp rhetoric, let's at least be honest, because this language was negotiated on the other side of the street by the House Republicans.
Is there any more discussion? Then the Secretary will take the roll on Senate File 2503. All members having voted that desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 61 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and is title agreed to. Announcements. Are there any announcements? Senator Miller.
Thank you, Madam President. Members, we will have another Purple Caucus meeting on Monday morning, April 18th at 10 a.m. All members are welcome.
Without objection, the following senators will be excused from today's session.
Madam President.
Who is it? For what purpose? Senator Hand.
Madam President, I just wanted to know if Senator Dibble would be willing to give us an update.
Senator Hand, I can have him do that, but why don't you just let me read these? Without objection, the following senators will be excused from today's session. Senators Brown, Hoffman, Metzen, Stump, Thompson, Reinert all day. Senator Latz, 11 to 11:55. Senator Dibble.
Madam President.
Senator Hand.
Thank you, Madam President. And I just wanted to ask Senator Dibble, we had a conversation last week about the Conference Committee on Transportation. At that time, Senator Dibble said that we were going to be seeing that Conference Committee meet this week. I think we have 1 or 2 more days left. I've not heard of any scheduled Conference Committee on Transportation. I also, Senator Dibble, the targets that were released yesterday from the majority, Transportation and Public Safety, $31.5 million. And I have not been a member of the Transportation Committee, but I'm trying to figure out how we do comprehensive transportation funding on $31 million. And maybe you can help me understand what the $31 million is in the target and when the Transportation Conference Committee is going to meet and actually get this resolved.
I'm sorry, Senator Hand. Senator Dibble is not on the floor. Would you like to have Senator Cohen address that issue?
Madam President, if he is willing and able, I'd be happy to.
Senator Cohen.
Madam President, Senator Hand, that's not the target for the omnibus transportation bill. That reflects a small amount of money for the supplemental finance bill, which has nothing to do with the omnibus finance bill. The other dollar amount is in there because it is general fund dollars that Senator Dibble has requested for the omnibus transportation bill. So the omnibus transportation bill is the much larger, much more comprehensive bill. That is not the bill.
Senator Hand.
Thank you, and thank you, Senator Cohen. So just to be clear that these targets have nothing to do then with the 2 bills that we said we were coming here this year to wrap up, including the transportation bill, that this target list that we have has nothing to do with resolving those issues. That's helpful to know.
Are there any other announcements? Senator Fischbach.
Madam President, would Senator Cohen yield?
Senator Cohen, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Fischbach.
Madam President, Senator Cohen, I guess since we are going into the budget process, maybe if you could give us an explanation. I know the Finance is meeting tomorrow. Give us some explanation of the process that's going to be happening with the omnibus, big, huge budget bill we're doing.
Senator Cohen.
Madam President, Senator Fischbach, happy to do so. The process that we're starting on is the process that has been used by the Senate for, as best I know, many, many decades preceding any of us on the floor of the Senate. So what we're going to do is we have articles for the divisions coming out of the divisions. They will then be in front of the full Finance Committee. The articles are not standalone because they'll be part of the supplemental finance bill. Again, comparable to what the Senate's done for decades. And but they're articles in finance. They're subject to amendments, discussion, votes, as we would have any other bill. And then, assuming the article passes in whatever shape it passes in, it will then be put into the supplemental finance bill. It's a process that, Senator Fischbach, you've been aware of during the years you've been on the Finance Committee, because that's the process we've always used, certainly going back to when you were first a member of the Senate. We used a very similar process, and the process used when I first came into the Senate and before I was in the Senate.
Senator Fischbach.
Madam President, would Senator Cohen yield?
He will yield. Senator Fischbach.
Madam President, Senator Cohen, could you just give us a timeline? We're starting out Friday. We're hearing, I think it's 4 articles tomorrow. So if you could just give us an idea of the timeline and as we can expect things to happen with Finance Committee.
Senator Cohen.
Madam President, Senator Fischbach, a couple comments. First of all, I recognize that this is maybe a little bit more rushed than prior years. One of the reporters told me that they had done some research, and this is without question the shortest off-year session we've ever had. And so as a consequence, the timetable is a little bit quicker than I might have hoped or have been more comfortable with. So my intent is to try to be mindful of the weekends and not keep folks here. In fact, Senator Fischbach, you and I have had a conversation that one of my predecessors was quite fond, the first person I served with as chair of the Finance Committee, was quite fond of having us meet until about 6 o'clock on Saturdays as we got to the end of the session. So I'm trying not to do anything like that. The intent is to take some of the smaller bills, some of the smaller articles tomorrow, and again, if we find ourselves in trouble where there's a lot more discussion, if folks feel the articles aren't quite ready, I don't want to pass them out where we haven't had a full discussion. Maybe it kicks into the first part of next week. But the hope is to try to finish this by Wednesday, Thursday, and then have the full bill ready to go. Again, it's a little bit more rushed because this is a much shorter session.
Any more announcements? Senator Latz.
The Judiciary Division of the Finance Committee will meet immediately following the adjournment of session in room 1100.
Senator Bach.
Madam President, I move the Senate do now adjourn until Monday, April 18th, 11 a.m.
On that motion, all those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion prevails. The Senate stands adjourned.